Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday, Yom Shishi. Let's light up the darkness. We also can wish each other a Guten Erev Shabbos because it starts tonight, and we can wish each other Gut Chodesh or Chodesh Tov because today's the first day of the new month of Sivan, a wonderful month that contains Shavuos. Shavuos begins Tuesday night, so we'll have to publish a holiday schedule. Most likely, if possible, I'll teach a class Tuesday at noon, right? If possible. Don't worry, Nina. I know you'll be very busy prepping for the holiday. I'll just handle that one on my own. Then we'll certainly be off on Wednesday. And then not easy to do a Thursday evening. So we're going to fall a little further behind again. We'll see. Let me just think about that. But at any rate, Shavuos is this month, the month of Sivan. Who's in the house? Renee in Indiana. Gordo in Scotland. Welcome, Renee. Wishing everyone a Hodesh Tov Sivan. Shandora in the Bronx checking in. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 99 here in Tractate Bava Metzia. I think this tractate is about 120 pages, if I recall correctly. Yeah, about 120 pages. So we're getting there. Page 99, we're going to pick it up at the bottom of 98b, and we're opening a new Mishna, Mishna number 3, here in chapter 8 of Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. Here's some people checking in. Randy in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire. Anybody find this on YouTube? Not yet. Okay, let's get going. Mishnah number 3. In the case of one who borrowed a cow, and the lender sent it to the borrower by the hand of his son, or by the hand of his slave, or by the hand of his agent, or by the hand of the borrower's son, or by the hand of his slave, or by the hand of the agent of the borrower, and it died on the way, so the borrower is exempt because the period of borrowing begins only once the cow reaches his domain. So, okay, we understand when the cow actually enters the physical domain, the geo domain, let's say, of the borrower, that's when his liability for the cow, in case it dies due to some circumstance beyond his control, which he'll be liable for because he's a borrower, So his liability only begins once it enters his property, right? Now, we understand that if the lender is sending the cow by the hand of somebody who belongs to the lender, either his agent or his minor child or his slave, and we're going to talk more about that. Obviously it hasn't left the domain of the lender, but interesting that even if the lender sends the cow by the hand of the borrower's son or the borrower's slave or the borrower's agent, these are all mentioned, still the borrower is exempt. And the reason is because the borrower didn't agree to this, right? The lender sent the cow by way of a person, let's say the minor son of the borrower, but it wasn't that the borrower said, okay, I agree, my son will bring the cow to me. And so it's still under the direction of the lender, and that's why the liability of the borrower has not commenced. But the borrower said to the lender, send it to me by the hand of my son, or by the hand of my slave, or by the hand of my agent, or by the hand of your son, or by the hand of your slave, or by the hand of your agent. But the borrower said, send it to me by the hand of this person, whether it's my son or your son. Now it's happening under the direction of the borrower. So we can see why this is a different case. Or even in a case where the lender said explicitly to the borrower, I am sending it to you by the hand of my son, or by the hand of my slave, or by the hand of my agent, or by the hand of your son, or by the hand of your slave, or by the hand of your agent. And the borrower said to him, send it as you have said. And the lender sent it, and the cow died on the way. Then the borrower is liable to pay the lender the value of the cow, since the borrower agreed to the cows being brought to him by the hand of another person. He bears liability from the moment that the cow was transferred into that person's possession. And so too, this is the law at the time when the borrower returns the cow to the lender. The borrower is absolved of liability only once the cow is transferred to the lender himself, or to someone who the lender agreed will bring it to him. Right? So it's one of these cases, again, this would have been very easy for them to clarify who bears liability when, if they spoke those words out loud and made a decision and made a contract, etc. But they didn't. And so we are left to apply the law and understand, who took possession, who took responsibility, when. And so basically, remember, the borrower is borrowing. So the only reason that the cow is leaving the lender's domain is so that the borrower can borrow. But even though they discussed, next week, do you mind if I borrow your cow? Sure, I'll lend it to you next week. And they didn't make any arrangements. So then the next week comes and the lender remembers. And so he says to his son, bring my cow over to Sal's house. Sal didn't agree to this arrangement for the transportation of the cow. So when the lender sends his son along, the cow is still under his direction, his supervision, technically in his domain. But if we had a conversation and said, hey, Sal, you want to borrow my cow next week? Yes, I do. I'll send it to you. I'll have my son bring it over to you. And Sal says, okay. So now when the cow sets out, even though it's being guided by the lender's son, Sal bears that responsibility from the time that the cow leaves the property of the lender. That's the Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 8. Now we're at the top of page 99a. The Gemara. The Mishnah states that if the borrower agrees to have the lender send the cow by the hand of the lender's slave and it died on the way, then the borrower is liable. And the Gemara asks, but isn't the hand of a slave legally like the hand of his master? As long as the cow is in the possession of the lender's slave, it is not considered to have left the lender's possession. Why then is the borrower liable? right? The slave is considered like the hand of the master. Thank God slavery doesn't exist anymore. But when it did, this is how it was legally understood. And the Gemara presents two resolutions. Shmuel said, the Mishnah is referring to a Hebrew slave whose master does not acquire his person, right? Remember, the difference between a Hebrew slave and a Canaanite slave is that the Hebrew slave is more of an indentured servant. He has to have all the obligations of a slave during the time that he's a slave, but that time is finite. It will end, even if he decides to stay with his master after the normal period of 6 years has ended, and he only became a slave, right, because he was a thief who got caught and couldn't pay it back, or got so into debt that he sold himself into slavery. But even if he decides to continue as a slave through that ceremony of piercing your ear against a doorway, when the Jubilee year would come, then even the Hebrew slave would go free. By contrast, the Canaanite slave was a slave for life, could even be inherited by the children of the master. He could be freed by his master if he gave him the bill of manumission, but in absent that, he would remain a slave. So there's a difference, legally speaking, between the Canaanite slave and the Hebrew slave. So Shmuel says the Mishnah is referring to a Hebrew slave whose master does not acquire his person. Therefore, property in the Hebrew slave's possession is not considered to be in his master's possession. The Hebrew slave is acting more like an agent or employee of the master. And remember that the master has obligations toward the Hebrew slave that are above and beyond his obligations to a Canaanite slave. He has to feed him and clothe him and bed him. Give him a bed to sleep in and a pillow to sleep with. Of decent quality, perhaps even as good quality as what the master himself uses. So Rav said, you may even say that the Mishnah is referring to a Canaanite slave, meaning that when the borrower agrees to have the cow brought to him by the master's Canaanite slave, then even though the master's Canaanite slave is like an extension of his hand, once he sets out from the master's property with that cow, it's going to be considered that the borrower has taken possession. If something happens to that cow, the borrower is going to be liable, even though it's a Canaanite slave. Why does Rav say this? Rav says you may say that the Mishnah is referring to a Canaanite slave, as this case may be considered like one in which the borrower said to the lender, hit the cow with a stick, and then it will come on its own to me. Now, just as in that case, the borrower is liable once the cow leaves the lender's domain, so too in this case, he is liable once the cow leaves the lender's domain, irrespective of the fact that it was brought by the lender's slave. The lender's slave is sort of just acting as something that, is helping propel the cow along, but it's only being propelled because the borrower said, send it to me. And it's because the borrower said, send it to me, or he agreed that it should be sent to him in this manner, that we say the borrower has acquired the responsibility and therefore the concordance liability if something goes wrong. The Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa. If one borrows a cow, and with the agreement of the borrower, the lender sends it to him by the hand of his son or by the hand of his agent, and it dies on the way, well, then the borrower is liable. If the lender sent it by the hand of his slave, then the borrower is exempt. So the final clause of this Baraisa seems to directly contradict the Mishnah's ruling. And the Gemara elaborates, well, granted, according to the resolution of Shmuel, one can explain that the Mishnah is referring to a Hebrew slave, whereas the Baraisa is referring to a Canaanite slave. If we make this distinction that the Canaanite slave is like the master's hand, but the Hebrew slave is not. But according to the resolution of Rav, who maintained that the Mishnah is referring to a Canaanite slave, well, then the contradiction poses a difficulty. So the Gemara presents a modified version of Rav's resolution. Rav could say to you, do not say in explanation of the Mishnah that the case may be considered like one in which the borrower said to the lender, hit the cow with a stick and then it will come on its own. Rather say that it is referring to a case where the borrower actually said those words. It's not a comparison. It's not like a metaphor. The borrower said, hit the cow with a stick and it will come to me on its own, right? Just send it on its way and it will come to me. This is something like between neighbors, right? Because the neighbor knows that if you just send the cow, there's no other place for the cow to go than over to the neighbor's house. So the borrower actually said these words, hit the cow with a stick and it will come to me on its own. So accordingly, one can explain that the baraisa is referring to a case where the borrower did not say those words, and therefore as long as the cow is still in the possession of the slave, the borrower is not liable if it's a Canaanite slave. But if he said those words, then if he said those words, then the slave maybe is the one who hit the cow with the stick at the instruction of the borrower, and that's why the borrower certainly becomes liable. As it was stated, one said to another, lend me your cow. And the lender said to the borrower, by whose hand shall I send it? Now you can see why the borrower is definitely acquiring the responsibility. He's the one who's going to decide the means of delivery. And the borrower said to him, hit the cow with a stick and then it will come on its own to me. So Rav Nachman says that Rav Bar Abu says that Rav says, in this case, the law is that once the cow left the domain of the lender and then it died, the borrower is liable. Because the borrower said, hit the cow with a stick and it will come to me. He acquired the responsibility. So the Gemara suggests, let us say that the following baraisa supports this opinion of Rav. One said to another, lend me your cow. And the lender said to the borrower, by whose hand shall I send it? And the borrower said to him, hit the cow with a stick and then it will come on its own to me. So the law is that once the cow left the domain of the lender and it died, the borrower is liable. Okay, says exactly what we just read a moment ago. Rav Ashi said that the baraisa is not a conclusive proof of Rav's opinion. It sounded like it said, the baraisa said exactly what Rav said. How is it not a conclusive proof? Says Rav Ashi, it is possible to say, with what are we dealing here? With a case where the courtyard of the borrower is situated farther away from the public domain than the courtyard of the lender, such that when the lender sends the cow to him, it will certainly go there. Consequently, the borrower is willing to accept liability from the moment that the lender lends it, which suggests that if the geography were not quite so apt for this thing, either the borrower would not have said, hit the cow with a stick and it will come on its own to me, or if he did, I don't know, maybe he was kidding. I mean, I'm a little bit confused what exactly is being said, but let's keep reading. Right. Let me make sure I'm understanding. Okay, so the Gemara asks, well, if so, if that is the case, addressed in the baraisa, right, where the geography supports this case, that the borrower only took that responsibility because there's no other place for the cow to go. So if that is the case addressed in the baraisa, what is the purpose of stating this law? It is obvious. And the Gemara explains, no, it is necessary for the case of a courtyard in which there are corners. Lest you say, the borrower does not rely on the possibility that the animal will come to him, as perhaps the animal will go and stand there in one of the corners and not come straight to the borrower's courtyard. So the baraisa therefore teaches us that even in such a case, he relies on the assumption that the cow will nevertheless come to him, and so he accepts liability, right? Like there's nowhere else for the cow to go, but there's a few, it's either corners in the courtyard or kind of a crooked path between the two courtyards. And the cow, if it's a dumb cow, might just get to the end of the little, path, and there's a sharp corner, and the cow says, well, there's a wall in front of me, so I'm just going to stop, right? And so it wouldn't go. And it's possible, if it's a very dumb cow, that it would feel like, well, nowhere else to go. I'm not going to turn. And the borrower, nevertheless, is saying, I think it will eventually turn and come to me. So he accepted the responsibility. And therefore, the cow dies along the way through some unforeseen circumstance beyond the borrower's control. He would be liable because he undertook that responsibility. Rav Huna says, in the case of one who borrows an axe from another, once he has chopped wood with it, he has acquired it. But as long as he has not chopped wood with it, he has not acquired it. Do you see the problem? We just said that the guy says, send me the cow. And then he has responsibility while the cow is traveling, even if it's being brought by the let's say the miner's son or the agent of the lender. He hasn't started using the cow, but he already has the responsibility. Now, with regard to an axe, they're saying, well, he doesn't actually acquire the liability to replace the axe until he not only receives it, but uses it. We're not even talking about transporting it. So why wouldn't the borrower be liable when, let's say, the owner of the axe's son is bringing the axe to him, if that's what he agreed would be the means of delivery? What's different about an axe? So the Gemara clarifies, with regard to what matter does one acquire the axe? If we say he has acquired it for the purpose of being liable for unavoidable mishaps, i.e. his liability as a borrower begins once he uses the axe, well then, one could ask, what is different when one borrows a cow that one is liable as a borrower from the moment of borrowing, even before one makes use of the cow? So rather, Rav Huna refers to something different. It's a different aspect of the law of borrowing that we're talking about. Rav Huna refers to one's right of retraction as follows. Once the borrower has chopped wood with it, the lender cannot renege on his commitment to lend the item. But as long as the borrower has not chopped wood with it, the lender can renege on his commitment to lend the item and prevent the borrower from borrowing the item. Very interesting. Tomorrow I have to chop down a tree. Can I borrow your axe? Yes, you can borrow my axe. The next day comes and the lender realizes he has his own job to do with the axe and he doesn't want to lend the axe because he needs it. What about the borrower? Is he out of luck? Yeah. But if he lends the axe to the borrower, and the borrower starts chopping down that tree, and then the lender runs over and says, wait a minute, I shouldn't have lent you my axe. I have to chop down my own tree. Okay, so the borrower can say, I relied on you lending me this axe. I've started the job. If I don't finish the job, we could multiply the difficulties by assigning circumstances to this case. But once he started using it, the borrower cannot renege on the commitment. He cannot retract. Before that, he can't. Obviously, if they entered into a contract and anticipated what would happen if you withdraw and what'll the penalty be, that would be something else. But they didn't speak about that, and that's why we're applying the law. Okay, so, and with this opinion, Rav Huna disagrees with the opinion of Rabbi Ami. As Rabbi Ami says, one who lends another an axe that is of property consecrated to the temple treasury has thereby misused consecrated property. That's the transgression of meila. Using consecrated property that belongs to the temple, belongs to God essentially. If you use stuff that's consecrated for your own benefit, then you have transgressed the prohibition on using consecrated property. That's called meila. Okay? So now it's interesting. It's not that the one who is going to use consecrated property for himself, but he's going to take that consecrated property and lend it to someone else. So who committed meila? Very interesting question. So when you lend something to someone else, who benefits? We've said before, well, the borrower gets all the benefit. Right? Because he's not paying for it. The lender doesn't get paid. That's the concept of borrowing. If the lender was getting paid, then it would be a rental, right? So the borrower who has the highest degree of liability has that liability because he's getting all the benefit. So if somebody is lending something to someone else and the borrower is getting all the benefit, then you would think that the one who's actually committing meila, because he's using consecrated property, would be the borrower. But surprisingly not the case. And what we should keep in mind is, well, actually, if you come to me and say, Sal, I really need to borrow your car. And I say, well, I really love my car, but okay, just take good care of it. And I lend you my car. Do I get any benefit from lending you the car? Yeah, because you owe me a favor, right? You owe me a favor. You think I'm a good guy. If you let people know that you've borrowed my car, other people think I'm a good guy. So there is a benefit to being the lender because people know, and particularly the borrower knows, that you lent this thing and now he owes you a favor. So let's keep reading. So Rav Huna disagrees with the opinion of Rabbi Ami. As Rabbi Ami says, one who lends an axe that is consecrated has thereby misused consecrated property. The lender has committed meila. And the lender is liable to pay the temple treasury according to the financial advantage that he received from lending the axe. The financial advantage. Isn't that odd? I mean, you could say, okay, people think I'm a good guy, you think I'm a good guy, you owe me a favor. But what financial advantage did I get from lending the axe? The financial advantage, there's a note about this. Let me get that. According to the financial advantage. So Rashi explains that this is referring to the value of the borrower being indebted to him, right? Owing a favor. And it is due to the value of this direct benefit that the lender receives that he is liable for meila. The Rid offers an alternative explanation. He cites the Gemara in Tractate Karisos, which teaches the following derivation. With regard to the misuse of consecrated property, meila, if one causes another to benefit from consecrated property, it is as though he himself derived the benefit. Therefore, even if the lender does not actually receive benefit from lending the item, since he caused the borrower to benefit, he, the lender, is liable for the value of that benefit. So yeah, the one who lends consecrated property, he is the one who has committed meila. What about the borrower? Hasn't he also committed meila? And despite this, the other person, meaning the borrower, is permitted to chop wood with that consecrated axe. And not only is he permitted, he's permitted lehatila, meaning ab initio. You might say, well, after he did it and realized that he did something, he realized something he shouldn't have done because it was consecrated property, then we would say he shouldn't have done it, but already he did it. But no, we say lechatila, meaning initially, ab initio, he can use it. In other words, the lender is the one who has committed meila. The borrower hasn't done anything wrong, I think assuming that he didn't know it was consecrated property, so he's allowed to use it. He did nothing wrong. The Gemara explains how it is apparent that Rabbi Ami, and what he just said about consecrated property, disagrees with Rav Huna. And if one holds that the borrower does, and what we're talking about, we're using this case of meila to get at when does a borrower become liable as a borrower if something goes wrong with the axe? Is it only when he uses the axe, or even while it's being transported, or even after he receives it but before he starts using it? And now we're going to use this case of meila to help us understand that. So, if one holds that the borrower does not acquire the axe from the moment of borrowing, like we said with the cow, then why has the lender committed meila? How can we say he misused consecrated property? If the borrower hasn't done anything until he actually uses the axe, then how can we say that the lender who took the consecrated axe and handed it to the borrower, how did he commit meila? Right? Because the axe hasn't been used for anything yet. To be liable for misuse of consecrated property, one must acquire the item, thereby removing it from the domain of the temple treasury. And furthermore, why is that other person, the borrower, permitted to chop wood with it ab initio? If the borrower does not acquire the axe from the moment of borrowing, let the borrower return the axe and not acquire it. And consequently, the lender will not have committed meila, as it will have turned out that nothing significant occurred at all. Rather, it is evident that Rabbi Ami holds that the act of lending is fully completed as soon as the borrower takes the axe from the hand of the lender, even before the borrower has used it. And this seems to contradict what we just said earlier, that the borrower of an axe doesn't become liable for damage to that axe until he uses it for some reason, even though he's already received it, let alone while it was being transported to him. And furthermore, with this opinion, Rav Huna disagrees with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. As Rabbi Elazar says, in the same way in which the sages instituted for buyers that they can acquire an item by pulling it, right? A kinyan, taking a formal acquisition of the object by pulling it in the case of an animal. And from that point, the transaction is completed. So too, or movable property, once they move it, it's like they have formally acquired it. And from that point, the transaction is completed. So too, they instituted for bailees that their rights and responsibilities are initiated by their pulling the item that they agreed to safeguard. And from that point, the transfer of the item to the bailee is completed, right? The formal act of acquisition, which precedes actually using the item in the case of the borrower. So this opinion of Rabbi Elazar is also taught in a baraisa. Just as the sages instituted for buyers that they can acquire an item by pulling it, so too they instituted for bailees that their rights and responsibilities are initiated by them pulling the item that they agreed to safeguard. And just as land is acquired either through the buyer giving money to the seller, or by the seller giving the buyer a bill of sale, or by the buyer performing an act of taking possession, a kinyan, where, for example, you transfer a handkerchief, right? You can't pick up land and move it. You can't pull it. So that's why you do these other symbolic things, either when the money changes hand or the bill of sale changes hands, or when they formally say, I am now transferring this field to you, and the guy takes a handkerchief and gives it to the other one to symbolize that. So that's when there's a purchase and sale of land. So too, a rental of land is acquired by the renter, either through the renter giving money to the owner, or by the owner giving the renter a rental document, or by the renter performing an act of taking possession, like the transfer of the handkerchief. So based on the assumption that the baraisa is referring to rental of movable property, as opposed to land, the Gemara asks, with regard to the case of renting in the baraisa, what is its purpose? I.e., why is it mentioned in connection with acts of acquisition that are effective with regard to land? We know that movable property is acquired in a different manner than land. So you can rent land or you can rent movable property. So Rav Chisda said the baraisa is referring to the rental of land, right? When we're talking about exchange, money changing hands, right? Because we've already covered that when I'm buying an object, right? And I give you, so I'm buying your toaster oven. I like your toaster oven. You're tired of your toaster oven. I'm going to buy your toaster oven. We agree that I'm going to buy your toaster oven. Once we've reached this verbal agreement, have I acquired your toaster oven? No. I'm going to give you $20 for your toaster oven. Here's the $20. You take the $20. Have I acquired your toaster oven? No. We discussed that, right? That the money changing hands for movable property is not the kinyan, is not the formal act of acquisition. And the reason being that I may not be able to pick up the toaster oven today. I may have to come back tomorrow because it's a big toaster oven. So you're holding on to it. So if I give you the money and I have now formally acquired it just because I gave you the money, then while it's still in your house, you might be lackadaisical in taking care of it after all, you're tired of it, so you might tell your kids, I'll put it in the backyard. Sal can pick it up tomorrow. And while it's in the backyard, it gets damaged. Whose responsibility is that? If I've already acquired it, then you're just watching it for me, unpaid, right? And so it's my problem. But the sages decreed that the money changing hands is not an act of acquisition for immovable property. It only becomes my property when I pick it up, right? Now I might pick it up and put it down and let you watch it for me, but now I've made that decision to do that. But if I haven't touched it yet, I haven't acquired it yet. So that's money changing hands for movable property. But land can't be picked up. So for land, the money changing hands does work, and witnesses can see that. And yeah, he gave over the money, and so now the land became mine. Now, apropos the mention in the previous discussion of one who misuses consecrated property, the Gemara cites a related matter. Shmuel says, in the case of one who robs another of a cake of pressed dates, and in the cake of pressed dates, there are 50 dates, which, when they are sold together as a bundle, sell for 50 less 1 perusos, right? Pennies. So in other words, they sell for a penny a date, but if there's 50 pressed together, you can buy them for 49 cents, 50 less 1. But when they're sold one by one, then they sell for 50 perusos. And the sum that the robber is liable to pay as compensation to the robbery victim, and the sum that the robber is liable to pay as compensation to the robbery victim actually depends on who the robbery victim is. Let's understand this. If one robbed and is paying compensation to a regular person, so he pays 50 less 1 perusos. If one robbed another of a cake that was consecrated to the temple treasury, and he's paying compensation to the temple treasury, then he pays the full 50 perusos and an additional fifth of the value as a penalty for having committed meila, misuse of consecrated property. Now, this is not so with regard to one liable for causing damage to consecrated property, because there is no penalty of an additional fifth just because you damaged consecrated property compared to damaging private property. It's the same. You just pay for the damage. You didn't misuse consecrated property when you accidentally or even intentionally damaged it, right? That's not misuse. You're just liable for the damage that you caused. But when you used it for your benefit, then you get penalized with this extra fifth. As the master says, that the verse states in Leviticus 22:14, and a man, if he eats sacrificial food in error, he should add its fifth on it. Not because he damaged it, but because he used it. He ate it, right? He drew benefit from it. By specifying that one who eats consecrated property is liable to pay the 1/5 penalty, the 20% penalty, the verse excludes one who is liable for causing damage from that requirement. So Rav Bava bar Abaye objects to this. Why, when he pays compensation to a common person, does he pay the 50 less 1? Let the victim say to the robber, I would have sold them one by one and received the full 50 perusos for them. You should therefore compensate me for the entire amount, right? Wholesale versus retail. Wholesale, right? You get the bundle price. It's not such a big discount, but if you buy 50 at once, it costs you 49 cents. But you could sell them one by one and get 50 cents, right? So why would the robber be excused from having to pay that extra penny? Just because they were pressed together as a bundle, since the victim, the robbery victim, the owner of the cake of figs, could have sold them one by one and made 50 cents. Why is it enough to just pay for the bundle at the 49-cent price? Which is not enough if it was consecrated and it was property of the temple treasury, then you'd have to pay the full 50. So Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yehoshua, said, we learned in the Mishna on page 55b of Bava, If an animal causes damage to another person's field, the court appraises a large piece of land with an area required for sowing 1 sa of seed, known as a base sa, in that field, including the garden bed in which the damage took place. And the court appraises how much it was worth before the animal damaged it and how much it is worth now, and the owner must pay the difference. Not how many plants did you damage, but what is the difference in value of this big field, with one garden bed in it a little bit damaged? It's a much smaller difference, right? Like if somebody was buying a whole field, like really the price wouldn't change because one of the garden beds was damaged, right? So it's a very slight difference in value. But that's how you appraise for this, right? You don't get the full value. So the court appraises how much it was worth before the animal damaged it and how much it is worth now, and the owner pays the difference. The court appraises not only the garden bed that was eaten or trampled, but rather the depreciation in value of the bed as part of the surrounding area. And this results in a smaller payment as the damage appears less significant in the context of a larger area. So in this case as well, the value of the entire cake is evaluated, not what it would be worth were one to divide it into smaller units. And the Gemara asks, is this to say that Shmuel holds that the law of compensation paid to a common person is not like the law of compensation paid to the Most High, i.e. to the temple treasury? But didn't we learn in Mishna Meila, page 19b, one who physically took a stone or a crossbeam from among items that were consecrated to the temple treasury is not considered to have misused the consecrated property. He is not considered to have committed meila yet, right? All he did is there was a bunch of construction materials that had been consecrated, and he picked up one of them and walked away with it. Did he commit meila? Not yet. If he then took that beam or that, stone that was going to be built into a wall or something, he took that piece of construction material and he gave it to another, then he committed meila. But that other person, the one who received this consecrated property, he is not considered to have committed meila. If after taking the stone or the crossbeam that was consecrated, one, instead of giving it to another person, instead he built it into the structure of his house, he is not considered to have committed meila yet, until he resides underneath it, thereby deriving benefit of the value of one peruta. Isn't that interesting? I mean, you walked away with consecrated property, but you haven't used it yet. You might be guilty of theft and of theft of consecrated property, but we're not talking about that. Right now we're talking about using consecrated property. So you haven't used it when you walked away with it. When you built it into your house, how can you say you haven't benefited from it? Well, you haven't altered it. That's why they're talking about a beam. You might use a beam, like a cross beam, in a house and without altering it in any way, right? Just as is. So since you haven't altered it, you haven't used it yet until you actually get benefit from it, like by sitting under it and it's holding up your house and you're sitting in the house. Now you used it. Now you committed meila. Or as soon as you alter it so it suits your needs, then you've made use of it and then you have committed meila. And Rabbi Bahu was sitting before Rabbi Yochanan, and he was sitting and saying in the name of Shmuel in reference to that Mishnah, that is to say, one who resides in another person's courtyard without his knowledge must pay him rent. Now we're talking about the squatter. We've talked about the squatter a bunch of times. You have the summer house that you never use. You forgot about it. You haven't been there in 3 years. I mean, you own it, but you never use it. So somebody who lives in that town where your summer house is noticed that house is sitting empty, and he moved in. He's a squatter. He's living there rent-free. Does he have to pay you rent? Well, on the one hand, he's living in your house. Of course he owes you rent. On the other hand, you weren't using it. You weren't aware that he was using it. He's actually giving you some benefit by being there, if he's a decent type of person, because he's not trashing it. He's actually living in it. And so therefore, it looks like the place is occupied, and that means it has an extra measure of safety. And by living in it, he's making sure that, it doesn't burn down and that, like bad stuff isn't happening to it because he's living there. He doesn't want that stuff to happen to it. So you're actually getting some benefit from him being there. So does he owe you rent or not? Those are the two sides of the argument. And the other things that are going to come into this are, well, what if while he's living there, you decide that you want to start renting it out and making some money? Now he has to pay you or vacate because now he's stopping you from making some money by renting out that property. And there's also the factor of, is he someone that could pay rent somewhere else and it's just more convenient for him to live there since it doesn't hurt anybody and that's why he's doing it. So here's the note. Just as one is considered to derive benefit from a crossbeam only when he's residing underneath it and must pay for that benefit, so too one is considered to derive benefit from the courtyard by residing in it, and he must pay for the benefit. It is apparent from this statement of Shmuel that the laws of compensating a common person are similar to and can be derived from those of the temple treasury. And this contradicts Shmuel's previous statement in the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan said to him in resolution of this difficulty, Shmuel retracted that statement of his. And the Gemara asks, but from where is it apparent that he retracted that statement concerning residing in another person's courtyard? Perhaps he retracted this ruling concerning one who stole a cake of pressed dates. And the Gemara answers, no, it must be that statement concerning residing in another person's courtyard that he retracted in accordance with the statement of Rava. As Rava says, using consecrated property without the temple treasurer's knowledge is like using property belonging to a common person with his knowledge, since ultimately the true owner of the consecrated property is God, and God knows everything that everybody's doing, so benefit from it is always considered to have been derived with the owner's knowledge. And consequently, one cannot derive an inference from the law of deriving benefit from consecrated property to a case of deriving benefit from a common person's property without his knowledge. Accordingly, it is more reasonable that Shmuel retracted his ruling about residing in another person's courtyard. And the Gemara cites another ruling concerning differing rates of compensation. And I'm almost done for today and with this Gemara. So if you have questions or comments, please get them in now. So Rava says, with regard to these porters who broke a shopkeeper's barrel of wine, which on market day sells for 5 dinars, but on other days sells for 4 dinars. So if they restore its value to him on market day, then it is sufficient if they compensate him with a barrel of wine, which he could then sell for 5 dinars. If they wish to repay him on other days, i.e. on a non-market day, then they must compensate him with 5 dinars. They cannot discharge their debt by giving him a barrel of wine, as on those days, that barrel is only worth 4 dinars. And the Gemara qualifies. And what's interesting is they didn't say when they broke his barrel. Like, I can understand they broke his barrel on a market day when he stood to make 5 dinars, then they owe him 5 dinars. But if they broke his barrel on another day, then don't they owe him 4 dinars? But the fact that they broke his barrel and he could sell it for 5 dinars on market day means that they owe him 5 dinars. So the Gemara qualifies Rava's ruling, and we said that the porters must pay 5 dinars on a non-market day only in a case in which the shopkeeper did not have other barrels of wine to sell on that market day, and consequently he lost out on a potential sale worth 5 dinars. But if he had another barrel of wine to sell, then he should have sold it. And the fact that he did not sell the wine that he had demonstrates that the porters did not cause him to lose out on a sale worth 5 dinars. And the Gemara further qualifies Rava's ruling, and when the porters pay the 5 dinars, they deduct from it the usual value of the shopkeeper's effort in selling a barrel and the usual cost of tapping a barrel, as the shopkeeper was spared these costs. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. here in chapter 8 of Tractate Bava Metzia, and it concludes page 99, and God willing will open tomorrow night after Shabbos ends with page 100 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, and with Mishna number 4. And of course, we're in that time of year when the Shabbat ends the latest that it's going to end. So I think last week I got on about 9:45. I really try to get on as early as I can, but like I get home from shul, we got to do Havdalah, etc. Okay, a few questions. Renee, did the laws pertaining to the treatment of slaves apply chutz la'aretz, meaning outside the land of Israel? Because we always talk about Canaanite slaves. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I think, anytime that a Jew if he owns a Hebrew slave, then obviously he has all the obligations, he has to treat the Hebrew slave like a Hebrew slave. And then in terms of owning a non-Hebrew slave, I just don't know what the laws were. I don't know the answer to your question offhand. It's a really good question, and I don't know what the distinctions would be between ownership, of a non-Jewish slave inside Israel or outside Israel when slavery was practiced in ancient times. Renee also asks, is it really understood that the lender is owed a favor? Yeah, right? According to Rashi. That's why it was so interesting that the Rid didn't agree with that. The Rid said it's not that he's owed a favor, it's that by lending the consecrated property to another person, he caused that person to use consecrated property. And whatever value that person got from using that property, that's what the one who committed meila, by putting the consecrated property in that situation, that's what he owes to the temple treasury. That is kind of a little bit easier to understand, and obviously can be quantified much better than what is the financial value of someone owing you a favor. How can you quantify that? Joseph, I'm loving how the sages put unspoken social rules like scratching each other's back in the center of the discussion. We often don't explain these things to each other in relationships, right? But we're aware of them, right? We're definitely aware of them. I'll tell you where that comes up all the time here in this community. People here tend to be quite charitable. They take the mitzvah of tzedakah seriously, and where it comes up a lot is everybody has their pet causes, right? So this guy, he takes like this particular yeshiva very seriously, and they have their annual fundraiser, and he asks everybody in the neighborhood to donate to that yeshiva. And somebody else has, like an organization that provide, that funds research for Parkinson's, and so he collects for that every year, right? And the guy who says, "Hey, I donated to your yeshiva cause. You donate to my Parkinson's cause." And there's that exchange of favors in a sense where nobody personally benefits. It's all raising money for their various causes, but there's definitely that, right? That exchange of, I supported your cause, you support mine. Sharon, 2 questions. 1, what is a consecrated axe used for? Great question. Are we saying that, well, the people who are doing maintenance on the temple need axes and I'm donating my axe to them, and it should only be used on temple property? Or as somebody said, okay, well, listen, I want to make a donation to the temple. I don't have money to give. I have an extra axe, so I hereby donate my axe to the temple. And what we would expect is that the temple probably doesn't need an axe, so the temple treasurer will sell that axe to someone who does need it, and the proceeds will go into the temple treasury. But until that happens, the axe belongs to the temple, and if it was used by somebody else, I would think that's what we're talking about. Sharon also asks, how would a borrower even know that the item was consecrated unless the lender tells him and he chooses to disregard this? Exactly. And I think that's why the lender commits meila and the borrower can use that object even lechatchila, even ab initio. I think you understood it exactly right. So that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, tomorrow night, as early as I can possibly make it, after Shabbos ends. Hodesh Tov. a good Erev Shabbos, and may it be a beautiful Shabbos for everybody, and may we hear